Hello everyone and welcome back to SciQuate. Today we are going to be discussing what you guys said that you'd like me to go over. So one of the main things was the biological explanations for schizophrenia, and that's what we're going to be going over today. So there are two main explanations that you need when talking about the biological explanations for schizophrenia. One of them is genetic explanations and the other is neural correlates. So what do we mean by neural correlates? Well, neural, you can think of brain, and correlates, you can think of correlation. So essentially all that's saying is stuff or a theory that is correlated with your brain. So let's discuss the genetic explanations first. So here's your AO1. Gottesman in 1991 found that if a person has schizophrenia, the following concordance rates apply. Now remember that concordance rates is essentially the likelihood of a relative also having a disease. So if I was a parent with schizophrenia, what is the likelihood that my child would have it? This percentage is known as the concordance rate. So the concordance rate between identical twins is 48%, non-identical twins is 17%, and in children is 13%. So how did Gottesman conduct his study? Well, he used fingerprint and blood tests to determine zygosity. So let's just remember, what is zygosity? Zygosity essentially refers to either monozygotic, so if we're talking about identical twins, mono is one, so monozygotic, one egg, or non-identical twins will be dizygotic, or two eggs. This experiment will be a natural experiment, as zygosity is a naturally occurring variable, and therefore the researcher cannot manipulate the IV. So the conclusion of Gottesman's study was that the more genes the person shares with the sufferer, the more likely they are to have the disorder. All this suggests that there may be a genetic basis for schizophrenia. Another bit of theory here for you. Schizophrenia is thought to be what we call polygenic. Essentially what that means is lots of different genes contribute to the increased risk of developing it. It is also what we call etologically heterogeneous, and that means that different combinations of genes are implicated in the disorder. Now don't worry too much about the detail here, but dropping in a phrase like etologically heterogeneous in an exam is going to make the examiner think that you really do know what you're talking about. And a guy called Ripke et al. In 2014 found that 108 genetic variations were associated with schizophrenia. Here's your AO3. So firstly, here's a weakness. Schizophrenia is not all genetic. As identical twins share 100% of their genes, it would be expected that concordance rate for schizophrenia would be 100%. However, what we said was the concordance rate was 48%. This suggests that other influences are playing a part. So these studies tie in with what Gottesman and Shields found, and they looked at the diathesis stress model of schizophrenia. So what do we mean by the diathesis stress model? Well, diathesis means a genetic predisposition. So, for example, having the genes for schizophrenia. And then the stress is something in the environment that triggers these genes to be turned on. So someone can go their whole life and have the genes for schizophrenia, but never develop the condition if the environmental stresses are not present. And this study ties in with what Gottesman and Shields found. Therefore, what we can say was, this research has concurrent validity. Essentially, they agree with previous studies. However, there is research support. Someone called Tianari et al. In 2004 found that adopted children of biological mothers with schizophrenia were more likely to develop the disorder themselves than adopted children of mothers without schizophrenia. And this supports the genetic link. If you have a parent who is biologically predispositioned to schizophrenia, even if you're not living with them in the future and you're living in a different environment, then you're more likely to develop schizophrenia. So what it's saying here is that genetics play a bigger role than the environment in the development of schizophrenia. Now, what it also says is that you're less likely to develop schizophrenia if your mother does not have the condition. And this is again in a different environment. This all supports the genetic link behind schizophrenia. However, another weakness is the methodological issues with twin studies. So i.e., where are twin studies not so good? These increased concordance rates that we see, so 48% in identical twins, may be due to the increased chance of sharing the same environment as opposed to the same genetics. So identical twins tend to share the same environment and therefore may be treated similarly. And this may lead to the stress part of the environment. So remember we talked about diatheses and stress. And their environmental stressors may be the same. And therefore this may be what contributes to the development of schizophrenia as opposed to genetics. Also, some of the participants in the studies were admitted to hospital in the 40s and 50s after their experiences in World War II as prisoners of war. These traumatic experiences in their environment may have led to schizophrenia, not necessarily genetics. The other explanation you need to know is the neural correlates explanation. Here's your AO1. So the AO1 is largely based around dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter in your brain. So there is two types of hypothesis you need to know. One is called the dopamine hypothesis, which was formed less recently than the newer version, the revised dopamine hypothesis. So what the dopamine hypothesis said was that schizophrenia was caused by high dopamine levels in subcortical areas of the brain, and I explained what subcortical meant in a previous video. Now, what is the word we use for high dopamine levels? Well, the word is hyperdopaminergia. So hyperdopaminergia is the increase in dopamine levels. And they thought that this increase in dopamine levels in subcortical areas of the brain influenced the development of schizophrenia. Additionally, an excess of dopamine receptors in the pathways from your subcortex to your Broca's area could also cause speech poverty and auditory hallucinations. These are symptoms we associate with schizophrenia. And finally, high levels of dopamine can be caused by neurons firing too easily or too many dopamine receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. This causes a greater excitatory effect and greater binding to the receptors, leading to more dopamine release. So if you have more receptors on your postsynaptic neuron, more dopamine is able to bind to those receptors and therefore generate a greater excitatory effect. Now this was revised by a few psychologists and biologists, and they essentially came up with the newer version, the revised dopamine hypothesis. So the revised dopamine hypothesis was kind of cornerstoned by a guy called Davis et al. In 1991, who proposed that low levels of dopamine, hypodopaminergia, in the cortex led to schizophrenia. That's different from what the dopamine hypothesis said, which was that high dopamine levels in subcortical areas causes schizophrenia. Also, the revised hypothesis says that low amounts of dopamine receptors in your prefrontal cortex causes problems with cognition, another symptom we associate with schizophrenia. And also, hypodopaminergia leads to subcortical hyperdopaminergia. And these high and low dopamine levels have different effects across the brain. And genes and early experiences of stress make some people more vulnerable to this. Here's your AO3. There is real-life application of the neural correlates explanation for schizophrenia. This has led to the production of typical and atypical antipsychotics, which are effective. Now, their effectiveness is proved by a guy called Thornley et al. Their effectiveness is proved by Thornley et al. In 2003, who reviewed studies which compared chlorpromazine to a placebo. This data used 1,121 participants and found that chlorpromazine was associated with better overall functioning and reduced symptom severity. So the fact that you are able to create a drug off the basis of this theory that is effective, it must mean that the theory itself is at least somewhat correct. So an antagonist is what the drug was, and that blocks the dopamine receptors. If you block the dopamine receptors, you have less dopamine binding to your postsynaptic neuron. If you have less dopamine binding to your postsynaptic neuron, then you'll have a less excitatory effect. Other neurotransmitters may be involved, and therefore the explanation may be seen as reductionist. McCutcheon et al. In 2020 used post-mortem studies and live scanning studies and found raised levels of glutamate in certain areas of brains of patients with schizophrenia. So maybe it's not all about dopamine, but glutamate may also be involved. Now, this is further reinforced by the fact that several candidate genes for schizophrenia, i.e. several genes that we believe cause schizophrenia, are thought to be responsible for the production of glutamate. There is also research support for the neural correlates explanation. Curran et al. In 2004 used amphetamines and showed that they increased dopamine receptor levels and worsened symptoms in people with schizophrenia, and induced symptoms in people without schizophrenia. Essentially what this is saying is, if you increase the number of dopamine receptors, you get a greater schizophrenic effect, which is essentially saying that more dopamine leads to more severe schizophrenia, and this supports the neural correlates explanation. This is also supported by Tolscher et al. In 2014, who found that antipsychotic drugs, which reduce your dopamine receptor activity, reduce the intensity of the symptoms. Because if you have reduced dopamine receptor activity, less dopamine can bind to your postsynaptic neuron, and therefore you have a less excitatory effect and reduction of symptoms. So this shows that the explanation is at least somewhat correct. So thank you very much for watching. Hopefully this was helpful for you to understand the two biological explanations for schizophrenia. I know this is one that people often requested, and therefore I did a video on it. Leave any other ideas in the comments below or visit my Instagram and leave them there, and I'll get around to hopefully all of your suggestions in the future. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.